Higurashi no Naku Koro ni is a series that has been near and dear to my heart for close to a decade. Horror anime typically don't have great reputations, but Higurashi is one of the few that's been able to maintain a dedicated fanbase that still persists nearly 20 years after the release of the first installment of the original visual novel by Ryukishi Gou. Higurashi follows a young group of friends in the rural Japanese town of Hinamizawa, a town that is said to be under the effects of a curse from a local deity known as Oyashiro-sama. For the past 5 years, on the day of a local festival called Watanagashi, one person is found dead and another goes missing. The series largely takes place in 1983, during the week of Watanagashi. The narrative consists of 8 chapters. Each is a seemingly unrelated series of events that typically results in tragedy for the characters. The series blends horror with mystery, and Ryukishi himself asks the reader to take it upon themselves to piece together clues across the different chapters to uncover the mystery of who or what is behind the tragedy of Hinamizawa. But the real heart of Higurashi is in its characters. The horror elements of the series are balanced out by slice-of-life moments where we get to see our leads get into wacky hijinks. These moments help make the characters even more likable, and they work as breathers from the grim subject matter. The slice-of-life moments also add extra weight to the darker scenes and are even frequently relevant to character motivations. Setting the series in 1983 was an interesting decision. A sizable part of Higurashi is about coming to grips with Japan's dark past as a nation, and this ties in with one of the central themes in the series, redemption. Every character has their own dark past, and depending on the series arc, they either succumb to their own shortcomings and paranoias, or overcome them with the help of others. I love a good bleak story now and then, but I especially love stories that are able to have crushingly dark scenes while balancing them out with a hopeful outlook on humanity. Before I go any further, I should clarify that this isn't a spoiler-free video for the original Higurashi, so I'd advise reading it if you haven't done so already, preferably the visual novel. I first got into Higurashi through the manga, which is a solid adaptation of the source material. I'd then go on to experience the series again through the visual novel as well as through the 2006 anime from Studio Dean. Now, I'll be honest. On its own, the anime is okay. It's not terrible, but as an adaptation, it's pretty lacking. Studio Dean aren't exactly known for their high production values, and as you'd expect, the animation here can be pretty bad at times, especially during some of the action scenes. Some shots lack a lot of detail and end up coming off as unintentionally goofy. Dean quality is in full effect here. What's worse is the number of important scenes that were cut. I get that adapting visual novels is difficult for length reasons, especially a million-word juggernaut like Higurashi, but some of what was cut was essential for understanding certain characters like Shion and especially Mion. There were even important clues for the mystery that were just completely absent. It was such a problem that they had to create an entirely new arc in Season 2 just to add plot points that were cut out from the first season. It all feels pretty clumsy. I will, however, compliment the soundtrack. It's appropriately creepy and atmospheric, even if it isn't quite as good as the visual novel's OST. I don't think the Dean anime was able to completely capture the heart of the original. It was desperately in need of a remake with better animation and at least all of the cut content that still made it into the manga. So, when a new adaptation was announced in July of 2020, this time being produced by Studio Passione, I was pretty excited. The trailers looked great, they got the entire original voice cast back, and the character designs were done by Akio Watanabe, who'd already proven his designs could mesh well with gore in Monogatari. Then it began airing, and yeah, it wasn't actually a remake. It turned out the entire production team, including Ryukishi himself, were doing a little trolling by pretending this new show, now titled Higurashi no Naku Koro ni Go, was a remake when it was actually a sequel. This was, understandably, a controversial move, and the series itself ended up being a polarizing entry for fans. But as for me, I had an absolute blast watching Higurashi Gou, and I'd probably consider it my favorite anime from 2020. Not that there was really that much competition that year. I'm going to try to be light on spoilers for Go until the end of the video, because I think this show is pretty great and I'd easily recommend it to fans. Keep in mind though, when I say this is for fans, I really mean it's for longtime fans. Not only is the original Higurashi required reading or viewing for Go, but there are also heavy references to other Ryukishi visual novels like Umineko, and even nods to Sakonia, which isn't even finished yet. As of now, I wouldn't say Umineko is required reading for the new anime per se, but keep in mind that I'm writing this before the sequel season Sotsu has started airing, so that could definitely change. First off, I want to quickly mention the openings of the series. The opening for the first season of the Dean anime played more on the horror and mystery elements of the series. It has an ominous mood, and it provides vague hints for the backgrounds and personalities of the characters without giving too much away. The opening of Kai is tragic in tone, indicative of the higher amount of emotional drama in the season. Go's opening, on the other hand, is more energetic. The steady build-up of the instrumental, along with the iconic imagery, just screams confidence. Higurashi is back, this time with a new mystery to uncover. Speaking of imagery, the visuals in Go are decent. It's clear this wasn't a high-budget affair, and sometimes you'll get hit with some really awful CG out of nowhere, like this water wheel straight out of a PS1 game. And sorry Oishi, but I'd rather not get in your CG car, even if it does have air conditioning. There are also some instances of looped animation that look pretty goofy, but when the show wants to look good, it looks good. The direction isn't always top-notch, but a lot of these scenes blow anything in the Dean anime out of the water. Just don't expect the Watanabe designs and head tilts to mean you're getting shots on par with Monogatari. The way certain scenes are framed and edited, though, really brings out the atmosphere in them. At points, the direction of the scene is even a clue in the story. Sound design was one of the big technical issues I had with the Dean anime. The cries of the cicadas will always be iconic, but there are a lot of moments where the sound design was just kind of lacking. Take the latter scene in Watanagashi, which is also not one of the better directed scenes in Go, funny enough. Visually, Mion/Shion has a really exaggerated freakout, but in terms of sound, there's not really much going on. There's absolutely no music, and the only sound effect is a really weak clacking sound. The poor sound direction makes the scene feel more awkward than creepy. Compare that to the ceremonial cotton drifting scene in Onidamashi. The beat of the drum, ringing of the bell, and clinking of the farm hoe all result in a hypnotic rhythm to the scene. The audio alone is enough to have the viewer entranced with Rika's dance, just like Keiichi over here. The beginning of Go starts off pretty close to the first arc of the original. The key difference with the premise of Go is that Rika remembers the arcs from the original Higurashi. Despite defeating the original culprit with her friends, for some reason she finds herself back in June 1983 to experience a whole new series of loops. The first few arcs of Go mostly follow the same framework of the first few arcs of the original, but with some different events and twists to keep the viewer on their toes. If I had to say what the biggest flaw of Go is for me, it's that the first half is slow. Higurashi has always been built around viewing repeated information and scenarios, but in Go, it can feel especially redundant. Even if Go is more than a decade removed from the source material, we're essentially seeing the same scenes again. The third arc, Tatari Damashi, suffers from this problem the most. Of course, this structure does end up making for a cool mystery format. As previously mentioned, there are a fair number of changes made to each arc. Some of them are inconsequential to the plot, such as the inclusion of slice-of-life scenes from the visual novel that were cut out in the Dean anime and the manga. This makes for some nice variety for people coming off of either of those versions of the story. Other changes actually end up having a major impact on how the arcs play out, and there are clues for the overarching mystery scattered throughout. The mystery of Go isn't as complex as the original Higurashi, and especially not Umineko, since it's not a 1 million word visual novel, but I think Ryukishi's writing ended up translating relating pretty well to the medium of anime. There's not as much information to keep track of in Go, but it contains the usual red herrings found in Ryukshi's stories, and, being an anime, relies more on visual clues. Go is pretty backloaded, with most of the major twists taking place in the last 2 arcs. As far as my non-spoiler thoughts go, I thought the big reveal this season was pretty good. It ended up pissing quite a few people off, but I thought it was an interesting way of building on top of the themes of the original Higurashi. I can't really say much more about it without completely spoiling the events of Go, so consider this the end of the non-spoiler section of the video. I think it's fitting that the premise for this season reflects the nature of Go as a sequel. After 100 years worth of tragic loops in Hinamizawa, Rika wants nothing more than to leave those memories in the past and move on, only for her to be pulled back into the loops of June 1983 all over again, similar to how Go itself suddenly pulled longtime fans back into the series after 14 years.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
The last 2 arcs in Go are completely anime original. Neko Damashi revolves around Rika repeatedly trying to figure out why she's stuck in another series of loops. After a series of failed attempts and some moments of self-reflection for Rika, we get the biggest reveal of Go at the end of the arc. The identity of the new culprit is none other than Satoko. First off, I want to say that I appreciate that Satoko actually gets an arc this season. She never really got a full arc dedicated to her in the original. The closest we got was Tadarigoroshi, which was less about Satoko herself and more about the psychology of Keiichi. A big part of Go, I feel, is about moving on. If the original Higurashi explored how bonds could be tested by trauma from the past, then Go is about how bonds are tested during the simple transitionary periods in life. There's a scene early on in the final arc, Satokowashi, where the club members are simply chatting as usual, but there's a notable absence. The club feels incomplete. Then Rena breaks the silence by mentioning the elephant in the room, Mion. Of course, it's 1984 now, so she graduated from the close-knit school in Hinamizawa. They'll still see each other again one day, but the group still feels like it's slowly coming apart. Then Rika tells Satoko about her ambitions of attending the prestigious St. Lucia High School. This, of course, means leaving Hinamizawa. But opposite to Rika, who wants to look toward the future, Satoko can't move on from the past. She doesn't want to leave Hinamizawa, and this is an important point for understanding her motivations. Satoko has experienced loss and abuse, more so than any other non-looper in the main cast. She had unhealthy relationships with multiple father figures, then lost her stepfather and mother, heavily implied to have been pushed off a cliff by Satoko herself while under the effects of Hinamizawa syndrome. After that, she entered an abusive household, and then she lost her brother. Rika was able to eventually stand on her own, and every other member of the cast has someone to depend on, but Satoko has nothing. All she has when she enters St. Lucia is Rika, and when even they start to drift apart, Satoko is in a vulnerable position, which makes it easy for a being such as Aiwa to manipulate her. What adds an extra layer of tragedy to the original Higurashi is that this Satoko isn't the one from Minagoroshi, where she had to learn to trust in her friends. Teppei didn't return to Hinamizawa in Matsuri Bayashi, so she never had an inner conflict to learn this lesson from. This makes Minagoroshi all the more tragic in retrospect, because it really was the perfect loop until the end. I think it makes perfect sense that Rika would want to leave Hinamizawa. She spent 100 years there, an entire lifetime, and a lot of those memories were of her and her friends repeatedly being killed. I've seen a lot of criticism for Go, and a lot of the more common examples concern Satoko's motives. Well, Satoko could easily use her looping abilities to study, so why doesn't she just use her extra chances to pass all her tests? This completely misses the point. Satoko didn't kill Rika and trap her in Hinamizawa because she was too dumb to study. She felt abandoned by Rika, forced to fend for herself. The rigid, almost militaristic academy also wasn't an environment where she could thrive in the first place. St. Lucia isn't a place where Satoko can live how she wants, so why would she want to fit in? And a large part of Keiichi's backstory involved him being ostracized by his peers specifically because he excelled in academics. So it would be a bit naive to assume that everything would go swimmingly for Satoko just because she passed her tests. Satoko's motives have also been labeled as childish, which isn't necessarily incorrect, but Satoko is also literally a child. Shion's motives and Mayakashi were childish, selfish, and formed from a misunderstanding as well, but that didn't take away from the tragedy of the arc. One of the central points of the original Higurashi was to trust and communicate with the ones closest to you. The tragedy of the earlier arcs was a result of the characters failing to learn this lesson. The conflict between Rika and Satoko isn't too out of line with the original messaging of Higurashi, since it's also based on a lack of proper communication and trust. Rika mistakenly believes Satoko can share her dream, while Satoko still suffers from her abandonment issues. Go is only the first half of the story, so there's a lot of room for speculation for Sotsu. Nekodamashi was left on a total cliffhanger, and there are other plot lines that began in Go that will likely play into the conflict in Sotsu. By the time this video is out, it'll be close to the time when Sotsu starts airing. Since this will be my last opportunity to do so, I'd like to speculate a bit. It's confirmed that Sotsu's first half will show Satoko manipulating everyone from behind the scenes in the first few arcs of Go. Admittedly, I'm not as interested in the mystery behind these arcs as I am seeing how Satoko interacts with Rena, Mion, and maybe even Teppei. Oni Damashi seems pretty open and shut, aside from the ending, but Wata Damashi could have more than meets the eye. It's implied that Mion may have been manipulated into killing Rika in Wata Damashi, but I'm not sure I buy that. Sure, we see her act a little unhinged in the recreation of Watanagashi's latter scene, but she seems a lot more lucid toward the end of the arc. Plus, Mion was the only character aside from Rika to never succumb to the severe effects of Hinamizawa syndrome in the original Higurashi. She's the most mature character of the group and has a strong sense of responsibility. She also tries to leave personal feelings out of important matters, though maybe it is as simple as her feelings for Keiichi being her one weakness. Still, I'm assuming all the murders were committed by Satoko directly. Tadori Damashi is a bit of an interesting one because we almost never see Teppei, who's the primary catalyst for the violence in Tadori Goroshi. There are a few possibilities as to what's going on behind the scenes, but Satoko could be using the fact that he's beginning to retain memories from past loops to her advantage to manipulate him into attacking Keiichi. I think other characters remembering things from past loops is going to end up being a big part of Sotsu. Characters like Takano and Teppei started recalling past loops, and this caused them to step down from their roles as antagonists. The scenes with Teppei especially were pretty surreal. It was kind of weird seeing a character who was originally a one-dimensional child abuser go through a redemption arc, but honestly, it doesn't even feel out of line for Ryukishi since he's done something pretty similar before. I'm just betting this plot thread will come into play toward the end with a big scene where every club member remembers past loops and teams up with Rika against Satoko. One last thing I want to mention is the sword shard that Rika has. Hanyu mentions to Rika that there's a sword in the shrine that can permanently kill a looper. When Rika checks the shrine, the sword is gone, with only a broken shard left behind. There's a possibility that Satoko could have the actual sword, and we'll see her steal it in an early arc of Sotsu, but I think it's more likely that the shard is all that's left. It's pretty obvious that Rika will have to make the choice of whether or not to use the shard to kill Satoko, and my prediction is that she won't end up using it. One of the central messages of Higurashi is that people can redeem themselves, something that, in my opinion, the game believes in even at times to a point of naivete. Rika and Satoko coming to an understanding after everything and forgiving each other would be classic Higurashi. I'm happy as well as surprised that Go ended up being, in my eyes, a more than competent sequel that lives up to the original. Expect a review on Sotsu after it's done airing, but for now, I have a video that's a lot bigger than this planned, so see you then.